Samuel Moyn is the Henry R. Luce Professor of Jurisprudence at Yale Law School and Professor of History at Yale University. He's written several books in his field of European intellectual history and human rights history. His newest book, which we're going to be discussing tonight, is Humane: How the United States Abandoned Peace and Reinvented War. His PhD is from Berkeley and his JD is from Harvard. Welcome, Dr. Moyn.
Thanks so much.
So take us through. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Take us through the argument of your book.
I'll just kind of lay it out briefly since we've lost time. That may be my fault. I'm really sorry that the first time in 2 years that Zoom has failed for me was tonight. I'm very apologetic. Look, this book is about the recent history of American war, and it looks back a long time to put this recent history in perspective. What I basically try to argue is that there was long ago a hope that war could be made more humane, that suffering could be reduced in it, both for soldiers and for civilians. But that dream never really got realized until Americans began to take that dream seriously in the last few decades. Now, it wasn't an American dream at first. Actually, it was some Swiss gentlemen who ended up founding the Red Cross that first came up with the idea that warfare ought to be made more humane. But for a variety of reasons, which, I wish I could show you some pretty slides I have to talk you through, it turned out to be American warfare that was the great power war that became more humane in its conduct in recent decades. And what the book tries to do is, just explain how that happened, what forces were at play, and also raise the question of whether there were costs. So offhand, you might assume that there couldn't be any. And I agree, and I try to argue as powerfully as I can that making war humane is a good thing, all other things being equal. But I also raise the concern, which figures like Leo Tolstoy raised right back in the 19th century when the Swiss first proposed this idea, that making war humane could entrench it. It could make it not just less visible, but also more tolerable to more people. And once Americans after Vietnam turned to adopt international standards, limit civilian casualties, stop targeting civilians in aerial warfare, at least, most of the time, the costs for peace, I think, have been high. And what I try to do is illustrate how at the beginning, before humane warfare was a real thing, there were peace movements, and they were very anxious about this agenda of making war humane. Not just Leo Tolstoy, a kind of, extreme pacifist, but lots of more mainstream activists who looked out at a violent world in which European states were fighting one another and colonizing the whole world, and said, what's much more important is to focus on limits to initiating and continuing war, not trying to make the fighting of it more humane. Well, I think Americans stopped having that debate after Vietnam, even as they struggled to impose controls on how they have fought their wars, especially in the heat of the arguments after September 11th, 2001. They lost sight of that, other agenda, and maybe in part because our leaders began to tell us that humane war was a morally appropriate way for America to fight. So with more time, and again, I'm very sorry this began so late. We could get into detail. What I think I'll do, I don't know what John thinks, maybe I should give just a little bit more of a taste of the argument about the recent period for about 10 minutes, and that still gives us half an hour to chat and for anyone
Absolutely.
who wants to engage and ask questions.
Absolutely. I think that sounds great. We've got the we'll curate questions for you, Dr. Moyn. We've got the Q&A feature running as well. So those of you who are listening, feel free to type your questions in or to upvote other people's questions if you'd like me to throw them into this conversation. But go ahead, Sam.
All right. So why don't I just take 10 minutes to describe the kind of last part of the book, which concerns the period from Vietnam to the present. So American War, when it gets escalated during the Cold War in Indochina in the mid 60s, there are concerns about how the war is being fought, notably around kind of napalm use and napalm production. But much or most of the public debate in the early going concerns whether it's appropriate to have a war there, and even whether it's legal under international law to fight there. So I take a close look at international lawyers who aren't invoking these Geneva Conventions that come out of the Red Cross history I mentioned in the 1940s. They're invoking the United Nations Charter and other treaties that are supposed to control force, keep wars from starting. And that fits together, we know, with the rise of a significant anti-war movement. And when the horrendous atrocity of My Lai is revealed in 1969, it throws fire onto the fuel of that pre-existing anti-war movement, because the discourse around international law had been not solely about how to fight, but whether to fight and what the limits on starting wars is. The atrocities that come home so forcefully to Americans due to the My Lai pictures and stories end up kind of creating a bonfire around the idea of constraint, keeping America from fighting this war and perhaps other wars. And as we know, there's a war powers resolution that comes out of the Vietnam War in 1973 that's supposed to restore authority to Congress to have a bigger role, which the Constitution gives it, in initiating and continuing wars. After that, though, I think that priority got lost. And it's interesting kind of why that happened. The anti-war movement's in decline. The Democratic Party, having run George McGovern and lost catastrophically, pivots to a kind of new vision for American power in the world among its leading foreign policy thinkers and ultimately its presidents. There's a group of humanitarians that emerge, notably in the group called Human Rights Watch, that abstains from ever commenting on the justice or legality of America starting any wars in order to focus on America's compliance with the rules of war, those rules in the Geneva Convention, which are updated in the 1970s to be much more humane in content around how war is fought. Maybe most faithfully, the military self-humanizes, as I call it. The military recognizes that it needs to update the notion of warrior's honor, and above all, some significant forces in the military understand the public relations hit that Vietnam had involved, and especially the My Lai revelations. And so they except that there are going to be new constraints in the fighting of war. And those revisions to the Geneva Convention in 1977 end up being fateful because they say for the first time that you can't shoot at a civilian, and they also declare that the amount of collateral damage when you're shooting at a military target is limited. That rules out all the aerial bombardment that America has conducted in prior wars back to World War II. That all matters because of what happens after September 11th, when the first stage of the war, the heavy footprint interventionist stage of the war on terror, initiated by George W. Bush, is made brutal and on purpose. Lawyers like John Yoo try to dodge the applicability of the Geneva Conventions. They also argue that international law shouldn't matter if presidents want to go to war, not just in Afghanistan and Iraq. But something interesting happens, which is the revelations of the Abu Ghraib atrocities. And what I want to suggest is that this moment of atrocity consciousness functioned very differently than in Vietnam. There had been a massive day of protest around the initiation of the Iraq War. Some people may have been involved in it, but it came and went. And in spring 2004, when Abu Ghraib was revealed, there was intense concentration on torture and detainee abuse, but not on the propriety of the Iraq War yet, or on that of the larger war on terror. And what this meant is that the concern with atrocity and inhumanity in war ended up functioning very differently, maybe in the opposite way from after My Lai, where My Lai had thrown fuel on the fire of an existing anti-war movement. You could say that Abu Ghraib removed the bug of inhumanity from a war that kept going. And what I try to show in the book in the final chapter is that Barack Obama was the one who understood this dynamic. He came into power in January 2009. He immediately declares that his America will never fight brutal war, and it will hew to the Geneva Conventions and the standards of humane war that Americans had already been accepting for the prior few decades. What he doesn't say is that America will give up war or the war on terror. And indeed, in that same first year of his administration, two things happen. One is that he wins the Nobel Peace Prize, and he goes to Oslo and says, I am at the head of the greatest militarized superpower in history. I can't be a man of peace, but I can promise you humane war. That's the content of his Nobel Peace Prize address. And of course, as we know now, he reinvents the war on terror starting in that same year. He pivots it away from the first form, which was heavy footprint and interventionist, to be more light footprint, using special forces much more regularly, or no footprint, using armed drones. And 4 years later, he gives another amazing speech at the National Defense University because the drone program has come out into the open. And he's imposed rules on it. And he gives a speech which, in which he wrestles with the outcome. There's a peace activist there who heckles him. Some of you may remember the coverage of this. And she's ejected. Her name is Medea Benjamin. But amazingly, she actually calls for more humane use of drones in her heckling. Obama kind of did her job in the speech when he went off script in response to her heckling. He said, maybe it's bad for great nations to be at endless war, that can have unpredictable consequences, not just for the world, but for the country engaged in endless war itself. I think it was the most dramatic moment of his presidency. And it was due to the fact that he was heckled, that he made these off-the-cuff remarks. And yet the broader function of the speech and the significance of his presidency was to rely on the promise of a more humane kind of war through drones, through special forces, to legitimate a counter-terrorist but endless campaign. Now, where do we stand today? I'll ask that question in closing and then take your questions, just including if they're skeptical, because I'd love to engage anything you find interesting or problematic. Well, Joe Biden has ended that first form of the war on terror. He's pulled troops from Afghanistan, which after the surge in 2009-10, Obama already began to do, drawing down Afghan troops from 100,000 to 7,000. Donald Trump drew them down further and struggled to withdraw completely, something only Biden was able to do for various reasons. But when he withdrew those troops, Biden promised to preserve so-called over-the-horizon counterterrorism. There's a review of drones in particular underway. We don't know the outcome of it, but the country hasn't given up the endless war that 9/11 ushered in. It's given up the most brutal form of it, the most visible form of it. And I think we're entitled to ask Obama's question. What happens to a country when it stops paying attention to the morality and legality of starting and continuing wars and thinks that making them humane is good enough? I think it's a dynamic that's appealing because humane war is better than brutal war. But if it's a recipe for endless war, I think we ought to give it a second look. I'll just close with a reflection on the recent New York Times exposés of the illegalities in the killing of civilians in the ISIS campaign, which again started under President Obama, but was made much more brutal and intense under his successor, Donald Trump. And most of the response to those revelations in the New York Times in the last few weeks, you could call it another version or our moment's version of Me Lie, have targeted the offensive brutality. And the question is, would it have been better if the war against ISIS had been fought with fewer civilian casualties, less brutal? Probably. But the broader war on terror, what's problematic about American militarism isn't just its brutality. And that means that making it humane may not be satisfactory, not just for its victims, but for Americans themselves. And so what I try to argue in the book is that it may be time to go back to what our ancestors thought, which is that starting a war is a gateway drug, and things happen after it you don't intend. And we should pay much more attention to initiating and continuing war and not solely concern ourselves with how it's being fought. So I'll stop there and apologize again for the technical snafu and love to hear what you're thinking.
So we have a question from Yelena Bieberman of Skidmore College, who asks, what role do you see covert action in the intelligence community playing in U.S. war making in light of your arguments? Should we think of covert action as part of or distinct from the U.S. reinvention of war?
Well, the great powers have always fought shadow wars. And especially during the Cold War, the intelligence services played a huge role in various shadow wars that were horrendous, and so there's nothing new. I mean, think in the Vietnam era of the CIA's creation of a private army in Laos, and so many other events. You can read Tim Weiner's book Legacy of Ashes if you're interested in that agency's star-crossed history. And yet, the role of covert action in my story suggests there can be some novelty too, because from the beginning of drone warfare, first the CIA and then a kind of collaborative effort between the intelligence and the military called the Joint Special Operations Command took the lead on this new form of shadow warfare. And it did make it less visible. Now, Obama insisted that no matter who was piloting the drones, depending on where they were deployed, they had to pay even more attention to the risk of civilian casualties than international law demanded. And so what I try to do is not tell a kind of exhaustive story of this new form of American war, because we'd have to get in, as you say, to the significance of the covert action statute and the kinds of forces that can be deployed under it. We'd have to get into, military procurement. We'd have to get into patriotism and what it can be led to support. What I try to focus on is something I just didn't think was getting enough attention, that amongst all the other factors, there's this new one, which is that there's an attempt to make war humane. And I just tried to kind of examine and meditate on what its function could be in helping entrench and legitimate different forms of war in our time, some covert, some not.
We have another question from Steve Hooger, who asks, how much of this shift has been driven by this kind of legal conversation and this conversation among activist communities, and how much has been the kind of revolution in military affairs, the rise of higher quality sensors, precision targeting, the ability to persistently surveil targets and therefore, in theory, distinguish much more between civilian and non-civilian people in a battle area. Where does that kind of precision revolution fit into this?
I think it's just right at the center, and it's another fantastic question. What I would want to say is I want to give the same answer in a sense, that we can look for lots of different reasons this is happening. And then the question is, where do we place the different things on the long list of causes? I'm not claiming that the attempt to make war humane is at the very top of the list. I just want to make sure it's on there. And surely it's the case that, ought implies can. And if you say that you want to make war humane, well, you having the technology to do it, it is absolutely pivotal. However, I want to push back a bit on the notion that, first came the technology and the capacity to be more precise, and then came, let's say, the moral window dressing. Because as we know, we get the weapons we, ask for and pay for. And in the old days, Americans had, no compunction about, purchasing napalm instead, or B-52s instead. And that was in part because it was not a threat to the legitimation of war to be brutal. And so my suggestion is that something big happened in the last few decades to change the conditions for legitimating American war. And what that meant is that, of course, it required technology to get done. but the old ways of war making weren't just obsolete technologically, they were becoming more obsolete morally, offensive to enough people that military action had to change in form. And so I'm interested in like how it is that something that's good about us, our ethical conscience, can end up kind of getting into war and making it a little bit better, but maybe at the cost of seeing it go on and on.
So we've got a question from Andrew Pace, who asks, can you define humane war? How is it different from, say, a police action or a limited war, or maybe a humanitarian war, as in like R2P? It sounds like you're referring to, he says, it sounds like you're referring to humane ways and means, constraints on how war is fought, rather than limitations on the ends or political objectives for which war is fought.
Correct. I mean, I'm very interested in the ends for which war can be justly or legally fought. And it's true that in the same time period, war has become sometimes morally appealing because it's said it's fought on behalf of humanity or humanitarian ends. But my focus in this talk and this book is on the means and on the idea that whatever the ends for which war is fought, it can be fought, if not humanely, then more humanely. And I think it's really important to focus on the possibility that it can. You know, an understandable temptation for many is to say, no, humane war is an oxymoron. It's a contradiction in terms. You know, there was even in response to the Syrian revelations that I mentioned in the talk, an article in the Week Daily the other I think Tuesday that was entitled "War Can Never Be Humane." But here's the thing: it can be more humane than it was before, measured in the absolute and relative casualty figures, the amount of death and injury that Americans cause. And again, we can say, and I believe it's still horrendous, but not compared to Vietnam before, or Korea, or World War II. And that's because of the means, the technological capacities that we now have finally to actually engage in precision warfare. But it's also because of the moral conscience that has been imposed by actors outside government, like humanitarians, and inside government, including significant politicians and military actors. And so what I mean by humane war is a new form of war that, whatever its other features, is fought with greater concern for the communities amidst which it's fought. Now, the interesting thing is that some lawyers in particular believe that humane war should take more care not to kill soldiers too, enemy soldiers. Now, we know that POWs have to be treated humanely. That's what the torture debate was about. But up until now, the rule has been that if you target an enemy, you can kill him anytime, awake, asleep, and on a global battlefield of the kind America created in the War on Terror. That means that drone warfare can come kind of out of the blue. But some argue that humane war should morph into policing. And that would mean, at least according to the highest ethics of policing, that soldiers are people too, and they have to be invited to surrender, just like police have to do, and that they have to capture in preference to killing, which would mean that drones can't just strike. Now, this is all still a pipe dream, but what's interesting to me is that some are dreaming it, like they want American war to be global policing in an almost literal sense. And again, if the alternative is brutal war, I'm for it. But why should we think that one country needs to police the world to begin with? And so I close the book by asking the question you're asking. What if humane warfare is approaching a kind of nonviolent policing or less violent policing? Does that make it good or sinister?
Yeah, so this question of policing, I think, gets to a critique that Dexter Filkins brought up in his review of your book, which was his review was written around the time Afghanistan, that the Taliban conquest was occurring. And he says, what lies ahead, as the chaos engulfing Afghanistan suggests, may not be that peaceful era of political freedom and pluralism which Moyn thinks our militarism blocked. And indeed, Moyn's singular focus on American power may come to seem strikingly insular. I'm curious if you have a reaction to that.
Well, I like the review. I think that, it's an interesting review, not least because Dexter Filkins, in an earlier book, popularized the phrase "forever war," which he applied to the Afghan war. That phrase originated in science fiction, but Filkins was, crucial in mainstreaming that phrase. And of course, it ends up being used by people like, Joe Biden in his campaign when he said he would get America out of the forever war. The criticism Filkins makes, as I read it, is that, well, America needs to gear up for more war now because the Afghan withdrawal is really part of a pivot to China and the coming of a new Cold War. And, I think that's insular to say that we need to get ready for another Cold War. Strikes me as not learning, the lessons of the last one, that confrontation is something that has a lot of unexpected and, in general, terrible consequences. So, maybe I misread the review, tell me what you think, John, but he closes it by saying, look, we need America to be fighting out there, especially with the rise of China. And, humane war is like, should be celebrated because it's something that, at least makes the eternity of American war more morally uplifting. Well, if that's his view, I'm not on board, because it just seems to me that every war my country has fought in my lifetime has made the world worse. And that's the problem, not the inhumanity of the wars alone. And so saying that we need to gear up for another war with China seems like not learning very much from all the misbegotten wars we've fought lately.
There's another question we have here from Jim Lewis out in West Virginia. Says American bases overseas where we are engaging in war often offer medical services to the local population. He says, I saw this in Honduras during our war in Central America. Is this another part of humane war? These, giving out candy to kids and that kind of thing.
I like that. I mean, I think it is, and depending on how broadly you define it, I would say, the American military has been involved in a lot of, winning hearts and minds, and that's central to, at least some of those who have tried to think about how it can, do even better than just strict fighting would involve. And of course, the military has been involved in, thinking about how to develop the world, and maybe we should count that as part of a kind of humane militarism. That's not what I do in the book, because I try to kind of focus intently and strictly on kind of the actual fighting and how it's done and what rules apply to it under international law, simply because they had such significance in the early part of the War on Terror when, the Geneva Conventions became famous and a lot of activism was devoted to humanizing the War on Terror. But you're right that in a broader sense, we should focus on all the ways that American war is transformed in the direction of, let's call it, moral uplift or, globally oriented generosity. Another example of this is, to add to your example would be the so-called solace payments. When the United States concludes that it might have, killed someone mistakenly, without usually accepting responsibility, it will often offer cash payments to survivors. And this, again, is not something that the law requires, but it's something that, that CENTCOM in particular began doing because it seemed to be the humane thing to do, even if for some observers it was really about shirking responsibility.
Well, I think that that brings up, the responsibility question brings up a bit of another question because with some of these recent revelations about civilian casualties in Syria and also the investigation into the Kabul strike, there seems to not be a lot of accountability, in particular
Correct.
in the Kabul case, and the rhetoric coming out of DoD was very bureaucratic, talking about how there were certain procedures that were not followed very well, but that this wasn't an issue. I mean, the article about the Talon Anvil targeting
Yep.
team in Syria even had a rather remarkable paragraph that begins with saying these people are very good at their jobs, but also they made a lot of very bad airstrikes. So how much of this
Yep.
is also like a bureaucratic story, a transformation of war into an almost an activity that's subject to administration?
No, that's certainly true. So, the truth is that almost no Americans have ever been held accountable for violations of the laws of war. And it's very natural to then say, well, that's the problem. And, I told a story in my lecture of how the military self-humanize, but if there's impunity for crime, and the kind of, the vast bureaucracies of the Pentagon and, America's, global military presence aren't really kind of enforcing the rules against soldiers who violate them, then what does it really mean? And that's, I think, a totally reasonable line of criticism. And these stories you mention are, have been radioactive for the government and the military, and for good reason. I'm kind of still out there arguing almost the opposite. Like, what if these rules were followed to the letter? Aside from the bad apple that gets punished, or the honest mistake that gets acknowledged, and maybe acknowledged with compensation. Well, you'd still have the war. It just would be fought in conformity with this very permissive set of rules that require you not to shoot at innocent people, and to limit, civilian casualties rather than inflict them excessively. And to me, it's like missing the point, because the primary question is, was the war legal? Was it moral? Did it set America back? Did it set the world back? And none of those questions get asked when we're reasonably caught up in a debate about failures of accountability, or whether there's accountability or not, looking at the atrocities, let's say, for their own sake. They're terrible. But, our ancestors, as I said, argued that we should focus earlier. If you stop a war, you stop war crimes, but the reverse isn't true. And yet we focus on war crimes, leaving the ongoing war kind of out of consideration too often. So, my response to these recent stories is very ambivalent because, of course, I would like humane war and accountability for brutal war, but I'd much rather have fruitless wars not fought in the first place. How do we organize that outcome?
Yeah, and so I think that kind of invites a question which one of our questioners, Alan Vo, kind of alludes to here, which is it may be that there's kind of a both and situation here where
Yep.
it's both better to if there's going to be war to have it be more humane and
Yep.
to not fight the war in the first place. And I'd imagine that there are a lot of people out there who would agree, say, for instance, I mean, there are probably a lot of the activist groups that are in this space who the people they can mobilize would agree with both of those statements. And so I guess, are you in essence offering kind of tactical to strategic advice for those groups that, hey, you need to spend a lot more time and energy on questions of whether war should be fought at all? Not necessarily that you should never talk about the humanity of war or humaneness in war, but that you need to put a lot more effort on stopping wars in the first place and stopping them once they've begun.
That's a big part of the message because, as I said in the talk, anti-war activism was much more prominent in U.S. history before our time. And humane war activism has, let's say, taken its place. And of course, we should have both all the time. But we really do need to think through why we lost the one and settled on the other. And then there's this other part of the message, which I think goes beyond the way you characterized it, because it's not just that humane war needs the cause of peace alongside it. It's that it can entrench war, and that's why I emphasize, Barack Obama, this kind of genius Machiavellian, so much in the talk and in the book, because he understood that these conditions for legitimating war having changed, over the past few decades, and especially after George W. Bush's presidency. Humane war could more easily, extended, could gain sufficient support to kind of fall off the radar. And so I think it goes beyond just kind of keeping humane war, because we also have to recognize this risk involved in it, that it can entrench or legitimate war itself. And so in a sense, humane war requires peace activism even more than we needed it before.
Time for one more question, and I'll go to John Mueller, a guy who knows a decent amount about polling in foreign policy. And he says, it's often argued that Americans don't care that much about foreign deaths in their wars, but instead care about the deaths of Americans. How does that fit into your argument? Because he says in polls, support for the Iraq war dropped after Abu Ghraib, but then bounced back. Huge numbers of foreigners have been killed by sanctions, yet this has had little political effect. Sanctions remain popular because no Americans are killed. What's your reaction to that?
Well, it's true, and it suggests that we need to take seriously, that polling data as a kind of factor in how we think about our moral actions, especially if we think foreigners do matter. And so the way I'd respond is in a couple ways. First, that let's say more internally focused moral sentiment of our fellow Americans is enormously powerful. And we've seen that 3 successive presidential candidates have succeeded by running against aspects of the war on terror. Obama against Hillary Clinton, and then Donald Trump first against his fellow Republicans, announcing on the South Carolina debate stage that he had opposed Iraq when they hadn't. And people thought the next morning that he had destroyed his candidacy, but in fact, that was when he surged ahead of his rivals, and then he beat Clinton again. And then, as I mentioned, Biden condemned the forever war in his campaign. And you can say, well, that reflected the awareness of these candidates that their domestic electoral success depends on that selective condemnation of war. But it's an extremely powerful force, and it has implications for victims. And then we have to hold them to their word, and not allow them to become, having been anti-war candidates, endless war presidents, which has happened in each case. And then I'd just add something broader that, if you look at Obama, when he defends the drone program, he doesn't say that it was most useful to him because it immunized American soldiers from harm, though that was true. The way that he thought that he could legitimate this new form of war was to say it's more caring for victims. And so there are some people for whom that matters, because otherwise Obama wouldn't have said it. Maybe he thought it himself, but he believed that it was legitimating for at least some Americans, and I would say elite liberal Americans, that endless war is fought humanely. And they may not be representative of all Americans, but they're really important and powerful. And so my effort in the book is to talk to them and to say, are you sure that the humanity of war makes it legitimate? Especially if it ends up getting entrenched and, the tools fall into the wrong hands after the next election, or when China starts using drones or whatever. So, I totally agree with the significance of this polling data, and yet it seems to really matter that some people think humanity towards the victim is of great importance, not just now, but in the future.
The new book is Humane: How the United States Abandoned Peace and Reinvented War. Dr. Samuel Moyn, thank you for taking the time to speak with us.
Thanks again, and again, my apologies, and thanks for bearing with the technical snafu.
Absolutely. Have a great evening, everybody.